Hello and welcome back for another GiantSlayerTV Top 10 video. Today's video will be a countdown of the top champions for rank play in patch 11.17. Meta has swum back towards the late game with a large emphasis on 4 and 5 cost champions. 1 cost champions that were doing well got hit by the nerf bat in the B patch, which cemented the late game meta we currently have. That said, the meta is diverse with a lot of viable champions and synergies. Let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Kicking off our top 10, we have Nunu coming in as the number 10 champion. Let's preface this top 10 by reiterating what was said in the introduction. The meta is quite diverse and a lot of champions are viable. This makes the top 10 list difficult because a lot of champions have a similar power level. Most of the 3 cost champions, for example, are comparable to Nunu. Nunu wins out mainly because of the consistency that he brings to the earlier stages of the game. Not only is he a fantastic frontliner thanks to Brawler, but his ability also does a good chunk of damage that often kills the enemy champion, particularly early on in the game. And on top of all of that is Abomination. Abomination is still one of the strongest synergies that you can run in stages 2, 3, and 4, assuming you're able to hit all the champions and 2-star a few of them. Nunu is the linchpin of Abomination, holding down the front line practically on his own until Fiddlesticks is added later. Without Nunu, there is no Abomination, and for that reason alone, we give the top 10 spot to him. Let's continue down the list to the next champion that comes in at number 9, Gwen. A lot of this list is going to focus on the late game, and oh man, does Gwen work well in the late game. Inanimate is a bit lacking, mainly because it lasts for such a short time and often doesn't even help Gwen who moves out of it, but Gwen herself is great. Mystic is always a high priority, though AD compositions have had more prominence in the meta, so Mystic may not always be necessary. What sets Gwen apart from other champions is her damage, particularly with items. It's actually viable to make Gwen your main carry, though she's generally better off being a secondary damage dealer. Items aside, her ability does base damage and a percentage of the target's maximum health. That means Gwen can absolutely wreck frontline champions if the enemy isn't running a ton of defensive synergies. And killing the frontline quickly is important in the late game, as accessing the backline is the fastest way to winning the round. Battle Mystics aren't a new concept, but Gwen really runs with it in the late game, making her an ideal champion to pivot into if you're stuck with a bunch of AP items and no one to give them to. Switching back to another 3 cost, we have Nocturne as the number 8 champion. There's a few reasons Nocturne only gets 8th on the list, but the main one is the recent B patch did lower his attack damage by 5. 5 less base damage isn't always that impactful, though in some cases it certainly can be. Basically, we're playing it safe because the patch is still new enough, we may end up seeing Nocturne lose a bit of priority in the meta. Nerfs aside, Nocturne is a beast and one of the few 3 cost champions still running around as a carry in the meta. As the meta shifted towards the late game, this means the pace of the game is slowed down, but Nocturne with an assassin board says no thank you to a slow game. The composition is easy enough to put together that an assassin player will often have a huge advantage in stage 4 since their level 7 board is going to be all around stronger than other players. Nocturne is the main reason for that with his damage output and the fact that he's a Revenant, making him both and the front line stay alive longer. Make sure you give him at least Last Whisper, 4 Assassin, and 3 Revenant. From there, all you need to do is hit Nocturne 3 and you're good to go with a Nocturne Assassin comp. Up next, we have Akshan coming in at number 7. Akshan is still one of the best late game AD champions, but we've lowered his placement in the top 10 from last week, mainly because 4 cost champions are actually viable now. That means players don't have to rely so much on hitting an Akshan 2, as champions like Aphelios and Jax are plenty strong and come online earlier in the game. That said, Akshan is still the end goal for a lot of AD boards because an Akshan 2 can 1v9. Plus, he reduces the armor of enemy champions, which makes him an easy companion to the other AD carries. But being a 5 cost champion, it can be difficult to upgrade him, and that's mainly why we've put him in at number 7. There's a new late game carry in town, and that champion comes in at number 6, Kayle. Finally, Kayle is a viable champion. It only took losing Verdant, multiple buffs, and several reworks for her to reach this status, but in the end, they did get there. Kayle is the ultimate endgame boss that can devastate boards once she's had enough time to scale in a fight. That scaling is the main thing holding her back, though, because the impact Kayle has early on in a fight is far less than a lot of other champions. At the same time, that scaling is also why she can be so good in the late game, since a fully ascended Kayle gains tons of bonuses and practically wipes out the enemy board by herself. And of course, she is a 5-cost champion, so 2-starring her is difficult. That makes playing Kayle a bit limiting, since hard forcing her is an issue, as you can't guarantee you'll be able to 2-star her. And overall, she's certainly one of the best late game champions, but has a few downsides that hold her in check. As usual, we have the duo Revenants coming in at number 5, Ivern and Volibear. Look, everyone knows Revenant is one of the best frontline synergies. Ivern and Volibear are two of the most commonly used champions for any comp in the late game. Fiddlesticks is also up there, but if you had to pick only 2 Revenants, it's always going to be Ivern and Volibear. Those two just provide too much value. They both have crowd control, though Volibear hits a wider area of champions. Ivern increases the health of your board by dropping a daisy, and Volibear destroys enemy shields. That's a lot of utility for 2 champions, and they're guaranteed to cast at least once per fight because of Revenant. We highly recommend these 2 champions as part of your endgame frontline. Next up, we have another AD champion coming in at number 4, Jax. Jax has quietly become a staple of the meta for quite some time. The reason he isn't always talked about is because 6 skirmishers aren't all that great in the meta beyond stage 3 and 4. Instead, Jax is used more as a secondary carry more so than a main one, since he's often tossed into comps due to Ironclad. But whether Jax is the main carry or not, he's an amazing item carry that ramps up throughout the fight. This is particularly strong during stages 4 and 5, where other players haven't quite solidified their front lines. If Jax has time to smack away at the enemy, the stronger he becomes and more likely he is to win the round. To help accomplish this, it's important to have at least one healing item on him and a bunch of defensive synergies like Knights or Ironclad. While Jax is one of the strongest mid-game carries, he will falter in the late game as other champions tend to scale better, specifically Kayle. And late game front lines are quite hard for Jax to kill. All in all though, Jax is a fantastic champion in stages 4 and 5 and should be able to secure a top 4 consistently with a proper composition and items. We're now into our top 3, beginning with Aphelios as the number 3 champion. Aphelios defines stage 5 of the current meta. It's difficult to 2-star him at level 7, so stage 4 can be a struggle for anyone running Aphelios. But once they hit level 8 and 2-star him, oh boy does Aphelios run the show. A common theme for carries in the current meta is scaling like Jax or Kayle. Aphelios also scales, though you do need a Rage Blade for him to do so. But with Rage Blade, Aphelios ramps up throughout a fight and cleans up enemy boards quite effectively on his own. Since he's a 4-cost, 2-starring him is a lot easier than other late-game carries, so an Aphelios player should be able to gain a health advantage. Of course, it's not all sunshine and roses for Aphelios, as you do need to upgrade him, have a Rage Blade, and a solid frontline to buy him time. Crowd control can also mess him up big time, so proper positioning is essential. Still, if all of the pieces are put together, Aphelios is by far the best mid to late game AD carry in terms of consistency. Next up, we have the gold standard of consistency coming in at number 2, Rell. Wouldn't be a top 10 without Rell being somewhere in the top 5. Much like Ivern and Volibear, Rell just brings so much value to the front line of any comp. And she can do it without any items or synergies. All Rell has to do is cast once to provide more value than most other frontline champions. But of course, she also brings more to the table because of her synergies. Redeemed is doing well, though a bit weaker after the Aatrox nerfs, but still with Kayle in the late game, it makes Redeemed a worthwhile investment. Oh, have you heard of Ironclad? One of the best splash synergies in the game, particularly in this meta which favors AD champions? Yeah, Rell is one of those. Cavaliers are a bit lackluster, but it's still useful for providing additional damage reduction. Ironclad is the big winner for Rell, as most players will want Ironclad. But as we said, Rell without any synergies or items at all is still by far the most valuable individual frontliner in the game. And with that, we can move on to the champion coming in at number 1, Teemo. Wait, hold on a minute. Teemo? At number 1? Yes, folks, it is true. We've mentioned multiple times that this meta is about 2 things, AD champions and the late game. What late game champion is absolutely bonkers into AD carries? Teemo. The CC of his ability is ridiculous against any auto-attacking champion, though it can be fickle since Teemo's targeting is random. Also, Cruel. Cruel, ever since they fixed the Hellion clone to work with it, wins quite a few late-game rounds. Anytime you can win a round, even by 1 unit, it is totally worth it in the late game. But it's not all perfect in the world of Teemo, as he does cost health. That means not every player can comfortably put Teemo onto their board, so he does end up favoring high rollers. That said, Teemo 1 is plenty strong, so if a player has enough health to invest in at least one Teemo, they should be fine. There's definitely a lot of RNG when it comes to Teemo, such as his targeting or being able to even find him in the shop. But if you're looking for the best champion to put onto your board in the late game, Teemo is it. That's it for our top 10 champions for patch 11.17. Before we go, we've got a few honorable mentions to cover. Our first honorable mention is actually two with Aatrox and Kalista. We have to acknowledge both of these champions because they played such an integral part of the first week of 11.17. Aatrox definitely had more of an impact, but it was rare to ever see one of these two champions without the other. Despite the nerfs, Aatrox is still a great early to mid-game 1-cost champion, and if you're running him, you definitely want to be running Kalista. Next up is Diana. We still think Diana is an amazing champion in the meta, but the number of compositions utilizing her are less than previously, particularly because of Yasuo falling off the meta. Now she's mainly used in Nocturne Assassin and occasionally in Aphelios comp. But we wanted to make it clear that Diana is still an amazing champion, so if you can find a way to fit her under your comp, then we highly recommend doing it. A big question right now is whether or not Heimerdinger is still playable. In the late game, when you can 2-star him and have items to give him, the answer is absolutely yes. Problem is, Heimerdinger is not worth it, and the time it takes for him to cast one spell is just too long for how little damage it's going to do. This means the consistency that Heimerdinger brought in the previous metas is no longer there, making him a champion of high rollers. Still strong, just far more difficult to use effectively. And we have our last honorable mention, Riven. If you're looking for an early to mid-game item holder, particularly during stages 3 and 4, look no further than Riven. After that point of the game, well, Riven will unfortunately fall off drastically. Even 3-starring her isn't as good anymore due to the nerfs. Riven is still plenty strong early on in the game, but don't expect her to carry beyond that point. Alright folks, that's all we have for you for today. As we said, there's a lot of viable champions in the meta right now. This top 10 is just to highlight a few of the more common champions that are doing well, but there's plenty more that we didn't talk about that you can use to climb the ladder. Let us know in the comments section below what champions you've been having the most success with. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.